What would you do if the most powerful woman in the city, the one who had just stepped down from a gleaming black car in a silk dress cut low enough to stop a room, walked straight up to you, pressed a document against your chest and said, "I have purchased every cent of your debt, and from this moment forward you belong to me"? Before you pass judgment, understand this. Behind that contract, behind those 8 cold words, there was no power play. There was no game of desire. There was a secret buried 5 years deep in the corridor of a county hospital on a night when a young woman had lost absolutely everything, and a stranger had offered her the only thing he had, which was a handful of balloons and the belief that hope does not disappear unless you let it go. Nathaniel Brooks had not let himself think the word hopeless. He was 28 years old, and he reserved that word for people who had stopped moving entirely, and he had not stopped moving. Not yet. The apartment was small, 40 square meters pressed into the corner of a building that had been declining for longer than Nathaniel had been renting it. The walls were thin, the pipes were vocal, and on the night the story truly began, the radiator had chosen to die. November rain hit the windows in long diagonal sheets. The single lamp on the kitchen table threw a circle of yellow light that didn't reach the edges of the room, and in that amber center, stacked in a pile that Nathaniel no longer bothered to straighten, sat a collection of envelopes printed in red. $200,000. He had not borrowed that sum all at once, which would have required a moment of audacity he didn't possess. He had borrowed it in pieces, a business loan to open a small carpentry studio, a medical debt accumulated during the 14 months his wife fought and ultimately lost, and then a series of smaller amounts meant to bridge the gap between those catastrophes and something resembling stability. The studio had not survived its first year. The smaller loans had grown. The numbers on the envelopes had stopped resembling anything he recognized as manageable. From the bedroom, his daughter coughed. Riley was 6 years old, and currently losing a prolonged battle with a chest cold that had entered its 4th day. She slept in the only real bed in the apartment with her stuffed rabbit tucked against her ribs, and the sound of her coughing, that small, persistent, slightly wet sound, was the exact noise that cut cleanest through every rational thought Nathaniel tried to organize. He was still kneeling on the floor with a wrench in one hand and a flashlight between his teeth when they knocked. 3 men. He recognized 2 of them. The kind of men who are paid to be unmovable, and who wear that quality on their faces so you understand the negotiation has already ended before it begins. Riley heard the knock and came out of the bedroom with her rabbit and pressed herself against her father's back. The man in front said what they always said. Nathaniel said what he always said. Then the sound of heels on the concrete staircase behind them, precise and unhurried, and a scent that arrived a moment before the woman did, cool, expensive, nothing like the building. The 3 men turned. What happened to their posture when they saw her was not something Nathaniel could have described precisely, only that it resembled a particular kind of capitulation he had never seen directed at a woman before. She was 27 years old. The dress was black, the neckline cut in a deep V, and a single strand of diamonds lay against her collarbone. She held a leather folder at her side and looked at the men with the patient expression of someone who had already resolved this before walking up the stairs. "You may go," Charlotte said. "Ma'am, we have an active collection." She opened the folder, removed one page, held it out. "You had one," she said. "That obligation was transferred this afternoon. There is nothing for you here." They took the page. They left. Nathaniel stood in his doorway with his wrench and his flashlight, and watched Charlotte Harrison step into his apartment with the unhurried ease of a person who considers every room navigable. She set the leather folder on the kitchen table, directly on top of the red envelopes, and turned to face him with an expression that was working hard to remain professional. $200,000, she said. "That is the amount I paid this afternoon. Your existing debt is gone. What remains is what you now owe me." She let that settle for exactly 1 second. "And the only form of repayment I will accept is this," You and your daughter will move into my estate before the end of the week. You will serve as my personal household manager." Riley stepped out from behind her father. She still had the rabbit. She looked up at Charlotte with the unfiltered curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that powerful people prefer not to be stared at directly. Charlotte looked back at her. Something passed across Charlotte's face, brief, uncontrolled, like light through a gap that closes before you can name it. "End of the week," she said again, and walked out into the rain. The estate was called Brooks Stone, which Nathaniel thought was either ironic or a coincidence he would have to live with. It stood behind iron gates at the quiet end of the city's oldest district, 3 stories of limestone and lead-pane glass, surrounded by a garden that never looked like it had been touched by wind. Riley called it the castle and meant it as the highest possible praise. Nathaniel called it nothing out loud and privately called it something he did not repeat around his daughter. His title was personal household manager. His actual function was to exist within the estate's operations at whatever point Charlotte required a human presence. Correspondence reviewed by 7 in the morning, wine sourced within 3 hours of a sudden request, curtains adjusted to the specific angle that admitted light without glare, the household calendar restructured around a meeting that had been rescheduled 20 minutes before it was supposed to begin. He did all of it. He did not complain. What he absorbed over the first weeks was not the difficulty of the work. The work was manageable. What he absorbed was the texture of the woman he was working for, which was the texture of a city that has been built entirely of glass, impressive from the outside, reflective in all directions, and cold to the touch. Charlotte Harrison ran a company, a household staff of 11, and a schedule that most people would have broken under, and she ran all 3 simultaneously without apparent effort. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Instructions given once were expected to be executed correctly, and if they were not, the look she gave the person responsible was significantly worse than being shouted at. The staff had opinions about Nathaniel. He understood this. He was not one of them in the way that mattered. Had not worked his way through the estate's hierarchy over years, did not have the unspoken tenure that made Mrs. Fairfield the real authority in the household. He had arrived overnight with a child in a single bag, and been placed in the East Wing with no explanation. He heard what they said about it once through a kitchen door, and he finished what he was doing, and went to check on Riley, who was painting a rabbit in watercolor with great concentration, and he did not say anything to anyone. What he noticed in those first weeks was not what Charlotte wanted him to notice. He noticed that she did not eat when no one was watching. He noticed that the lights in her study were on past 2 in the morning more nights than not, and that by 5, when he came down to begin morning preparations, they were sometimes still burning. He noticed that on Thursday evening she poured herself a glass of wine, and sat beside the east window and watched the garden until the glass was still half full, and had gone warm, at which point she set it down and went back to work. He noticed that she never laughed. He noticed all of this and said nothing, because the terms of the arrangement did not include observation. Until the night he heard the thud. He was in the kitchen at 9:30 with a schedule summary spread across the table when the study went wrong. Not loud, just a particular arrangement of silence that followed a sound he recognized as involuntary. He found her on the floor beside her desk, her phone a few inches from her hand, her color almost entirely gone. He did not call anyone. He had done basic medical training years ago, and he knew what he was looking at. He got orange juice from the refrigerator and helped her sit up against the desk, and waited without speaking while the glucose worked its way back through her system. When her color returned, he went to the kitchen and made porridge, simple, from memory, salt and ginger and nothing performative about it, and brought it back and put it on the edge of the desk. She looked at it for a long time. "You didn't call the house physician," she said. "You were already stabilizing." She picked up the spoon. "The kitchen supplies are for staff meals. I know that." He moved toward the door. She said his name. Said it the way people say a name when they have been using a title for too long, and suddenly notice it. She told him to call her Charlotte. She said formal titles were exhausting, and it was late. He nodded and left. The next morning, Riley slipped out of her watercolor lesson and navigated her way to the sitting room where Charlotte was working before a 9 o'clock call, and she stood in the doorway with her hands behind her back and her expression set to maximum sincerity, and produced a yellow paper flower she had folded herself. It was slightly lopsided. It was made with full commitment. "Dad said you're the one who saved us," Riley said. "I made you this." Charlotte put down her documents. She looked at the flower in Riley's outstretched hand, and the thing that moved across her face was not something she was able to manage in time. It lasted only a moment. It was enough. She thanked Riley in a voice Nathaniel had not heard her use before. Riley nodded with satisfaction, turned, and skipped back down the hall. Charlotte set the paper flower in the center of her desk, in front of everything else, and did not move it. It was still there 3 months later when Nathaniel found the oak box. Charlotte had asked him to clear the East Corridor storage room, a room that had been locked for as long as any of the staff could remember and that no one volunteered to enter. He worked through it systematically, cataloging what he found, setting things in order, until he reached the back corner and the canvas dropcloth and the old trunk beneath it, and, resting on top of the trunk, a wooden box sealed with a small brass latch turned green from years of neglect. He opened it. Inside was one photograph. Real paper, not a print, slightly overexposed, the framing imprecise, taken in a hurry by someone who was thinking about something else. The image showed a hospital hallway. Linoleum flooring, fluorescent panels, the particular institutional gray that all hospital corridors share. 2 figures, one seated against the wall with her knees drawn up and her face angled away. The other crouched beside her, leaning forward, holding out a loose bouquet of balloons on ribbon, yellow, red, and white, bright and ridiculous in that sterile light. Nathaniel sat down on the floor of the storage room with the photograph in his hands. He was 19 years old when he volunteered at Millbrook General. He came on weekends because a neighbor had suggested it, and then because it steadied him in a way he could not explain, the act of being present in a place where what you did mattered immediately and concretely. He worked the pediatric wing. He carried things for nurses. He read to children who were bored or frightened. On the nights the gift shop was closing, he sometimes bought what was left of the balloons, because they cost almost nothing, and they reliably improved a child's mood. He remembered the night in the photograph. He had been coming around the corner toward the children's ward when he found her. She was on the floor of the corridor with her back against the wall and her shoulders folded inward, and there was a quality to her stillness that he recognized without being told, the stillness of someone who has just received news that reorganizes everything. He learned later from one of the nurses that her parents had both been brought in that evening following an accident on the highway, and that neither of them had made it to morning. He had not known what to say. He had never known what to say in those moments, which was why he usually didn't say anything. He sat down on the floor beside her. He held out the balloons the way you hold out something to a child when words are the wrong tool. "As long as you don't let go," he said, "hope will never fly away." She had taken one string. Just one, and only with one hand, and she had not looked at him. They sat there in the corridor for a long time, and a nurse eventually came and found her, and she stood up and walked away, and Nathaniel had gone back to the ward, and he had never seen her face clearly. But in the photograph, taken from an angle he hadn't been aware of by someone he had never identified, there was enough light on the left side of her neck to see it. A small, distinctive mark just below the collarbone. He had seen that mark every day for 3 months. The estate held a charity dinner in early December. 60 guests. String quartet. The specific social configuration at which Charlotte Harrison was fully at home and fully unreachable. The version of herself that moved through formal rooms in a deep red dress, like someone who was born knowing exactly how much space to occupy. Nathaniel was not on the schedule. He was in the East Corridor when the music began, and he stood still for a long moment with the photograph in his pocket, where it had been for 2 days. Then he walked toward the sound. He waited until Charlotte was alone at the edge of the room. He stepped in front of her. She read his expression before he said a word. He saw it. The way her face understood something was about to change and made no move to stop it. He held up the photograph. What happened next was not the collapse he had half expected. It was quieter than that. The thing that sustained Charlotte Harrison's composure at all hours, and in all rooms, simply became, in the space of 2 seconds, too heavy to hold. Her expression did not break. It settled. Like a person sitting down after a very long time on their feet. "The storage room," he said. "The oak box." "Yes," she said, very quietly. "You knew from the beginning." "Yes, you tracked me down, for 5 years. When I found you, the debt was already building. I had money, and you had too much pride to take it from someone you didn't know, and I understood that about you from the file before I ever met you." She did not look away. "So I constructed a situation where your pride didn't have a door to walk out of. That was wrong. I know. You decided what I would feel, and when I would feel it. You decided what Riley's life would look like for 3 months without asking either of us." His voice was controlled, but his jaw was tight. "And now I can't look at any of it. At the porridge, at the window, at any single moment that felt real in that house, without asking myself whether it was real, or whether it was something you arranged." Charlotte was quiet. Her hand was at her side. "The feelings were not arranged," she said. "I can't verify that." "That's what you took from me." He removed the photograph from his pocket, looked at it once, and held it out to her. "What I gave you that night was worth what it was worth because I gave it without thinking about it. You've spent 5 years trying to repay something that was never a debt. What you built instead has the shape of control." He stepped back. "I'll repay every dollar. On a schedule I set. With what I earn. It will take time." Charlotte took the photograph. She held it in both hands and looked at it and did not speak. "We'll be out by morning," he said. He walked back through the party without stopping. Charlotte stood at the edge of the room with 60 guests around her and the music playing on, and she held the photograph of a hospital corridor and a girl who had not let go of a balloon string, and she did not move for a very long time. The new apartment had 1 bedroom and a kitchen that 2 adults could not stand in simultaneously. Nathaniel slept on the fold-out sofa and gave Riley the bedroom and told her the castle had been a chapter, and chapters end and new ones begin. Riley considered this and accepted it with the equanimity of a child who trusts her father's version of events. He went back to work. Carpentry, not the studio. Nothing ambitious, just the work itself, job to job. What his hands knew how to do without being told. A bookcase. A window seat. A kitchen table for a family of 5 who needed something that would survive children. He was good at the work. He had always been good at it. The calluses came back inside a week. He slept badly. He had told Charlotte, on his way out of that party, "The kindness I gave that night came from my heart, and that is why it was worth something. Your kindness carries the taste of control, and I will not accept it that way." He had meant every word. He had written a version of it on paper and taped it above the sofa so it was the first thing he read each morning. He still thought about Thursday evenings. About wine that went warm, and lights that stayed on, and a paper flower in the center of a desk. Riley asked about Charlotte once on a Sunday morning over cereal. She asked if Charlotte was lonely. Nathaniel said he didn't know. Riley thought about this and said that she hoped not, because Charlotte had looked like someone who had forgotten how to have a normal day, and that seemed sad. Then she finished her cereal and went to read her book. Nathaniel sat at the table for a while after that and did not start anything. 3 weeks after they left the estate, Riley did not come home. She was supposed to walk 4 blocks. She had done it 6 times. She always arrived at the same time, always slightly windblown, always with a story. At 3:45 she was not there. At 4 she was not there. At 4:30 Nathaniel had already walked the route twice in both directions, spoken to the after-school aide, and called the police, and his hands were steady in the way hands get steady when the body has decided panic is not a useful option right now. What he did not know yet was that the men who had come to his door 3 months ago were not independent contractors. They worked for a set of business interests that had been quietly applying pressure to Charlotte Harrison's holdings for 2 years, and Nathaniel had been a vector in a strategy that had not concluded when the debt was transferred. Someone had tracked Riley's route from school. Someone had made a calculation that a 6-year-old was a more effective message than anything sent in an envelope. Charlotte received a call at 4:15. She had kept a security consultant monitoring the situation, quietly, unknown to Nathaniel, unknown to the staff. She had also placed a small tracking device in the lining of Riley's school bag during the weeks the girl lived at the estate, on the logic that she was responsible for them, and responsibility, for Charlotte, had always meant preparation. When they left, she had not removed it. She had not been certain she had the right. She had left it and hoped she would never use it. She did not make phone calls. She did not assemble a team. She drove herself. The building was 4 blocks from the school, a vacant commercial unit, the kind of space that accumulates in old neighborhoods like sediment. Charlotte came through the side entrance alone, found Riley in a back room with 2 men who had not been expecting a woman in a work dress to come through the door without backup, and she positioned herself between them and the child. Nathaniel arrived 4 minutes later. He heard Riley before he saw her, her voice carrying high and thin through the empty building, calling his name the way children call for the one person who makes all other people feel temporary. He came through to the back room at the moment the geometry of the situation shifted, a blade, a man moving, Charlotte stepping into the space between. She went down in his arms. The cut was shallow. The surgeon would say clean and shallow, and she would need rest. But she was on the floor of a cold, empty room, and her breath was unsteady against his shoulder, and Riley was pressed against his side with her rabbit, and the men were gone, and the silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that only exists after something terrible has just barely failed to happen. "You put a tracker in her bag," Nathaniel said. "Yes, you kept watching over us. The whole time. I did it quiet." She paused to breathe. "I didn't want you to feel like I was controlling anything again. I needed to know you were both safe. I didn't know how to stop needing that." He looked at her. There was nothing composed about her. No careful brightness. No sealed expression. Just a woman on a cold floor who had come alone because a child she loved was somewhere she shouldn't be, and she had not stopped to calculate the cost or plan the exit. She had simply come. "Charlotte," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." The hospital had the same linoleum, the same light, the same smell of recycled air and institutional cleaner as every hospital Nathaniel had ever been in. He sat in the chair beside her bed. Riley was asleep in the other chair with her rabbit under her chin, breathing the slow, boneless breath of a child who has used up all her adrenaline. The surgeon had said what surgeons say about rest. Nathaniel sat with the information and did not leave. He thought about what it means to do something without calculating it first. To drive yourself somewhere dangerous without assembling backup, without a contingency plan, without knowing whether the person you were going for will be grateful or still angry or somewhere in between. He thought about the corridor at Millbrook General, and a girl who had taken one balloon string in one hand and held it, and who had apparently never stopped holding it, not in 5 years, not through the complicated fortress of a scheme that was never really about money and was always about the simplest possible thing. When the early light changed the room from gray to something warmer, Charlotte opened her eyes, and he was there. "You stayed," she said. "Yes." A silence. Not uncomfortable. "I was wrong," she said. "In everything I built around this, I was wrong. You were scared. That doesn't make it right, no, but I understand it." He leaned forward. One honest answer. No architecture around it. She waited. Were the feelings real? Charlotte Harrison looked at him the way people look when they have nothing left to manage. "Yes," she said. They existed before I put any of it in motion. They were the reason I put it in motion. They got considerably harder to carry every week after you arrived." He was quiet for a moment. "Then we begin here," he said. "Not from the contract. Not from the debt. From this room, right now, with nothing owed in either direction." She looked at Riley sleeping with her rabbit, and then back at him, and the breath she let out was the kind that comes after a long time of not breathing quite fully. She nodded. Charlotte resigned from Harrison Holdings on a Thursday in early spring. The board's response was composed and considered, and barely concealed its bewilderment. She had built the company from a restructured inheritance in 8 years of work that most people would not have been able to sustain, and she walked away from it without a counteroffer in hand, which the board interpreted as irrational and could not argue with. She did not elaborate. She did not look back. Nathaniel opened the workshop that June. A real space this time, north-facing windows and a long bench and the smell of sawdust from the first week forward. He called it Brooks Architecture and Woodworking, which was aspirational for its current scale, but he had always been of the opinion that a name should describe the destination rather than the starting point. Work came slowly, and then steadily. A set of built-in shelves. A kitchen renovation in a house where 3 generations were about to overlap. A dining table commissioned by a family who wanted something that would still be standing when their grandchildren were adults. He measured carefully. He built to last. Charlotte learned to eat in the mornings. She learned that silence in a room was not the same as failure, and that a conversation without an agenda had value she had not previously assigned to it. She practiced these things the way she practiced everything, with attention, with willingness, with someone who noticed when she was backsliding and did not let her get away with it. Riley started first grade. She made friends with a girl named Marigold, who had strong opinions about everything and voiced them without hesitation, and a boy named Tobias, who was quiet and drew very good animals in the margins of his notebooks. Riley told her father one evening, with the calm authority of someone who has already decided that she was going to be an architect. Not just any architect. One who built houses where people were actually happy inside them. Nathaniel wrote that in the notebook on his workbench. He did not write anything else on that page. The beach was south of the city, the kind of beach that does not appear in any directory and requires knowing someone who knows it. Wide and flat, with sand that was cold even in July and water that was more honest about its temperature than inviting, and above it all, a sky that in summer opened into something that made the rest of the year feel provisional. Riley ran ahead. She had carried a bundle the entire drive down, refusing to let anyone else hold it, holding it in her lap with both arms for 2 hours. She undid the knot at the top on the sand and pulled out a dozen helium balloons, yellow, red, and white cheap latex from a shop they had passed on the way, the kind that deflate in 36 hours and are none the worse for it. She distributed them with the systematic precision of a child, executing a plan she had been developing for some time. 4 to her father. 4 to Charlotte. 4 for herself. She made them stand at the water's edge. The sand was firm and cold under their bare feet. The wind came off the water and pulled at Charlotte's white dress, and she was close enough to Nathaniel that he could feel the laughter she was trying to contain, not the polished kind that fit formal rooms, the real kind, the one that arrived without being summoned and did not care about the occasion. "When I say go," Riley said, with the gravity of a director who has spent significant time on this choreography. She looked up at both of them once, confirming positions, confirming readiness. "Go," she said. They opened their hands. The balloons rose fast and together, and then the wind found each one separately and sorted them out into a loose, bright scatter across the blue, yellow and red and white, climbing higher and smaller and more joyful the further they went, until they were just light against the sky, and then the light was just the sky, and the sky was full of everything. Life runs in circles that only become visible when you stand far enough back to see the shape. Kindness given without calculation, the hand extended in a cold hallway, The absurd and genuine offering of balloons to someone who has just lost the most important people in the world does not simply exit the story when the moment ends. It goes somewhere. It becomes part of the structure of things. And when you arrive at your own floor, your own worst corridor, your own night that reorganizes everything, it comes back. Not always in the form you expect. Sometimes it comes back wearing a leather folder and a black silk dress and words that sound like a transaction. Sometimes it comes back sideways, through a constructed situation you didn't design and couldn't have predicted, offered by someone who spent 5 years searching for a way to say thank you that wouldn't frighten you off. The method was wrong. Charlotte would say so herself, clearly and without defense, as many times as Nathaniel needed to hear it. She had built a fortress around a feeling because she was afraid of what would happen if she simply showed up and said, "You held my hand in a hallway 5 years ago, and I have not forgotten it, and I do not want to forget it." But the feeling was real. That was the only thing that was never in question. Nathaniel Brooks had been 28 years old, and running out of options on the night a woman in a diamond necklace walked into his 40-square-meter apartment and rearranged everything. He had not known then, and would not understand until much later, that he had already done the work that mattered most, on an overnight shift at a county hospital when he was 19 years old, carrying balloons down a hallway and finding someone who needed something to hold. You cannot buy what he gave. You cannot schedule it or structure it or repay it in any currency that exists. You can only do what Charlotte eventually did, find your way back to the person who gave it, stand next to them on a cold beach with the wind in your hair and your shoes off, and open your hands at exactly the right moment. And let go. And watch what rises.